I am delighted to introduce Dr. Carola Suarez-Orozco, HGSC Professor in Residence and the Director of the Immigration Initiative at Harvard. Take it away, Carola.
Hello, everyone. I am delighted to have this conversation with you. Have been thinking a great deal about school climate in the last 20 years, really, but most specifically recently. And so I'm going to start today by asking you all to tell me why you think school climate is important to understand. I always like to start with a little bit of interaction. I'm going to, so you know, the plan is for me to talk a little bit about what is school climate, and then switch to why I think it's particularly important for a group of students who are growing in our schools, immigrant origin students, and how they've been underrepresented in our assessments of school climate, and then take it from there in terms of what we can do and what we should be doing. So share with me, please, what do you think school climate, why do you think school climate is important to understand? Either in person, either just say it out loud or in the chat. And Lisa, if you can monitor the chat for me, I'd be grateful.
Sure.
There are no right or wrong answers. And one of the first ideas I'm going to share with you is that school climate research and the thinking about school climate is all over the map in terms of what is school climate and why it's important. So part of what I'm going to try to do is help us think a little bit more systematically about why it's important. But yes, so Lisa?
Carola, so Quentin says school climate can affect student motivation and achievement.
Spot on. That's one of the reasons why it's important. Anybody else?
Armin says a healthy school climate understands the experiences of students beyond the walls of the school necessary for serving students.
Excellent.
Helena's school climate helps students create a vision of themselves. Lucia says it is very important because it determines life for everyone in the school unit.
All right, so all beautiful ideas around what school climate is. So I just went quickly, Google Images and picked, put school climate in and came up with just randomly a few representations of school climate out in the world. And as you can see, it's represented in all sorts of ways. Sometimes they put school climate at the middle and they talk about physical environment, social environment, learning environment. Other times they talk about leadership and systematic staffing development. It's very focused more on the staff part of things. Sometimes it's focused on safety and interpersonal dimensions. On the bottom right hand, this is the way PISA looks at school climate. All very different ways of zoning in on it. And I'm going to tell you that one of the challenges with the field is it's such a messy concept. There are many ideas and terms, and part of the reason why when we do research in the field, we get very different kinds of findings is because people are measuring very different things along the way. So part of what I've done when I started working in this field is tried to unpack what is school climate and why it matters. So in broad terms, TAPA did a very systematic literature review and basically found that there are 5 key domains of school climate. One is and the main reason why school climate is important is because it leads to school improvement efforts. That's what's been driving a lot of the work in the field. But in terms of the field, there's the institutional environment, there's teaching and learning practices, there's an emphasis on relationships, and then there's safety dimensions, all sorts of safety dimensions from the physical to the psychological to bullying. And then there's a related idea, which is school belonging, which often gets intertwined into school climate. I'm going to try to share with you what I think school climate is. You can take it or leave it, but I'll give you what I think the synthesis is. It's a multifaceted concept that encompasses the collective experience of the quality of school life on campus. And a positive school climate is the product of a school's attention to fostering safety, promoting academic, disciplinary, and physical, positive physical environment, and encouraging and maintaining respectful, trusting, and caring relationships throughout the school community. That means beyond the school walls. Critically related to school success as well as positive youth outcomes. So as I mentioned, the main motivator and the reason why schools are buying into the notion of addressing school climate, it is seen as a way to drive forward school improvement work. And why it really matters in terms of key outcomes is it's important for academic outcomes as well as, and here I'm taking a very student-centered perspective. It's important for academic outcomes as well as the psychological and physical well-being of students. So here I've thrown out a lot of ideas. Let me give you a visual that kind of tells the story in a minute. So going back to the far right of this diagram, the outcomes that matter. Academic outcomes are things like lower truancy, lower dropout rates, better grades. And from the psychological well-being point of view, things like better psychosocial well-being, better outcomes in pro-social behaviors, better mental health, better, lower risk behaviors. All of this has been found through research. So these are not just ideas, they've actually been established as key outcomes that matter. And then in terms of domains of the what is school climate, it's things like the institutional environment, the learning, teaching and learning processes like diversity and equity kinds of teaching, relationships between peers, between teacher and student, and between educators and families, as well as safety. And the really key ones that keep coming up over and over and over again are dimensions of relationships and safety. And why does it matter? And how does it relate to school belonging? School belonging is the moderator of all this. So all of these domains of school climate predict school belonging, the sense that kids are part of, or that all the members of the community are part of the school, that they matter in the community, they're seen in the community, and that predicts school belonging, and that in turn, school belonging predicts these various outcomes. Does that make sense as a kind of what these different ideas are and how they relate to one another? Yes? I'm looking for a couple nodded heads or thumbs up here or there. All right, so now we're going to switch a little bit. So that's what school climate is and why it matters. So now I'm going to, change the gears a little bit, or change directions a little bit, and talk about a group of students that I care deeply about, that I've been thinking about for the last 30 years, and that is immigrant origin children. These are, they make up 26% of the children and youth in our schools today. Most are the second generation, 88%, meaning that their parents are immigrants, and they were born in the US, but 12% are first generation. But they share many features in common, many which I've written about, and that's another conversation and another lecture. I began to think about the whole issue of school climate in relation to these kids when I did a study at Harvard some 25 years ago, where we followed 400 immigrant newcomer kids from Haiti, from the Dominican Republic, from China, from Mexico, and Central America. So we followed them for 5 years. They were on average 12 years old, and we interviewed them every year. We interviewed their parents the first and the last year of the study. We collected all sorts of school data. We did some assessments with them, and we were trying to understand how could we understand how they integrated into the schools, their trajectories of performance over time, and what was going on in their families, what was going on in their own lives, and what was going on in the schools that were serving them. And the kids were started out in 51 schools. They ended up in 156 schools by the, 125 schools by the time we were done with the study. But what we got to see was a whole lot of different kinds of schools that these kids were attending. And we began to see that we thought schools were important because it's the initial space of contact for newcomers. It's also a setting of sustained contact between the family of origin and the host culture. And it's such a potentializing space for educational attainment, for social belonging, and for civic and social participation. So we thought, let's pay really close attention to what's going on in schools. However, we did a lot of field work, a lot of ethnography as we were doing this work, and we began to realize that there were distinctly different climates of inclusion among schools. Most, I would say, were relatively immigrant student oblivious. I would put most of them they just were, they were the kids were coming in and they were doing what they could, but barely had a way of systematically thinking about them other than as language learners, certainly not with a social emotional lens. Some were downright immigrant student hostile, and some, on the other hand, were incredibly responsive and doing what I would want to see for my own child, which is always kind of the metric I use for, what I'd like to see schools doing. So, and these different kinds of climates of inclusion contributed to varying outcomes for our students. But there was a real challenge in trying to assess this systematically. At the time, this was 2000 when we were doing the study, right around the turn of the century, which makes it sound a long time ago. There were no systematic measures of school climate at the time. It was just not a field that there was work being done. So our approach was really ethnographic. And we used rough proxies for regressions, things like school segregation, school poverty. We had a measure of students' perceptions of violence. We had a measure of the students' perceptions of their relationships with educators, a measure of relationships with their peers. We also tried to develop a kind of a checklist of, do they have representation of diverse kids in the schools? Are the bathrooms clean? Are security guards respectful with their students? Is there a receptionist who's bilingual and pleasant with the parents? We had all sorts of indicators, but it was very hard to get integrated reliability on these measures. So, it was really just beginning to burgeon, and there were no measures at the time. So in the ensuing years, a couple of things happened. One is that the socio-political context for immigrant origin kids got a lot worse. It was never great, but it got a lot worse. The national and state immigration policies heated up, the rhetoric heated up, media representations heated up, and social attitudes towards immigrants and people of color didn't get better. And we know from, using an ecological model that these, the macro system trickles into the more proximal systems, which in turn has implications for children themselves. And a couple of studies looked at, otherization cascading into schools, racialization and xenophobia. The Ian Gunda and as well as Rogers studies showed that immigrant origin students were reporting much higher levels of bullying right after the Trump election. And a Rogers study of school administrators showed that they were reporting a heightened anti-immigrant sentiment on campus with consequences for school engagement for their students, as well as mental and physical well-being. So, and in terms of my own work in the field, what I have typically found is that immigrant origin students are either kind of invisible or they become hyper visible. depending on what's going on politically and socially. So post 9/11, Muslims became hyper visible. During the Trump era, Latinos became hyper visible. During the COVID pandemic, Asian folk, Chinese in particular, but anyone perceived as Chinese, became hyper visible. We now, with the Gaza war, Muslims and Jewish folk are becoming hyper visible. So this sort of comes in and out of salience, if you will, and it trickles into schools. The other thing that happened was there was a growth in school climate assessment research. All of a sudden, it exploded as a field. It started in college campus work. Higher education began taking school belonging and school climate really seriously, and there were lots of measures that were started to come out. And then it began to emerge in the K through 12 work. So things like Panorama, Youth Truth, there's a number of others. So all of this changed over the last couple of decades. However, immigrant origin students continue to be invisible in these measures. So there are no questions that ask. So they will typically ask about what race students identify with. They will ask about gender, but they often ask about LGBTQ plus identification, but they will not ask, were you born? Where were you born? And where were your parents born? So there's no way to, and they don't ask about religion either. So there's no way to, aggregate out the experience of kids who are of immigrant origin. And we can have conversations about the whys and the hows and, what we should be thinking about and trying to move this work forward. But, I'm just planting that seed. We partnered, so I tried to figure out how to get to this information. So I partnered with Youth Truth, which, has an established track record in 39 states and having done surveys with over 2 million students. And they had a bunch of questions around school climate, relational relations with teachers and peers, safety, around psychological safety and bullying, culturally responsive practices and such. And we added questions around immigrant generation, region of origin, race and ethnicity, languages other than English spoken at home, religion and economic status. So we partnered with them and we piloted this new protocol in 8 schools with a total of over 3,215 with a total of 3,215 students. And so what we were interested in understanding was, do students from distinct generations of immigrant backgrounds, the first generation, second and third, report different perceptions of teacher relationships and psychological safety in school? And then do these dimensions of school climate contribute to reported different senses of reported school belonging? And then does school belonging mediate academic engagement, academic challenge, and mental health? We would have loved to test our whole model, this fancy one I showed you before, but we didn't have questions, we didn't have measures for each of one. So this is what we would measure with this particular survey we had in hand. So what we found, and I'm missing an arrow here, is that immigrant generation indeed predicted quality relationships with teachers and school safety and school belonging. This is actually the model we tested, and this is what it looks like. So immigrant generation predicted relationships. First generation had reported poor relationships and less sense of safety. That in turn predicted belongingness. And then there were differential patterns of academic engagement, challenge, and emotional health as a result. So this is preliminary evidence, not on a very huge sample, but preliminary evidence that, in fact, immigrant origin young people are having different experiences. Okay, it's not a big sample, it's preliminary. But part of the problem is it's very difficult to get access to schools. So we had money for 20 different schools. We only were able to get access to 8 schools. I see a nodding head, Kalam. Yeah, really hard to get access to schools. So we had money for 20 schools for our first round. We only got access to 8. Then we had another little small grant where we again had money for 20 schools. Again, we only were able to get 10 schools. And in that sample, which we have not yet analyzed in depth, what we found was that the schools who agreed to participate were schools that had much better school climates than average. So if I'm a principal and I let someone in, it's only if I feel confident that my school climate is pretty good. So it's then very hard to test our model of our immigrant kids having a different experience, because the only schools that let us in are the ones with good climates. So, there's lots of reasons why I hypothesize that there's, access is difficult. One is pandemic fatigue. It's difficult to get into schools for anything. There's, I think there's a lot of resistance to what I call the I word, immigration, which happens to be my passion. And but I think there's a lot of resistance and concerns around immigration of late. And that leads to lots of sampling challenges. Who are we gonna learn from? Who lets us in, so to speak? And I would argue that, and I'm almost done talking because I really want to kind of introduce get to the conversation. And I've got some slides around recommendations for practice if it's helpful. But, why does it matter? I think it's really important to diagnose immigrant origin students' experiences in schools. They are having different experiences. There's lots of ethnographic evidence of that. And our data suggests as much. And it's important to identify which groups are most at risk in what contexts. And we need to, provide a measure for interventions on front lines, so then we can then assess whether the interventions are having intended effects on outcomes for these students. And then I have the little icon of GLSEN. This is the model for me in many ways of why it matters. So how many of you are familiar with GLSEN? No. Okay, so GLSEN was a survey that started maybe 2 or 3 decades ago, which was to identify the experiences of gay, lesbian, straight, gay and lesbian and LGBTQ youth in schools. And basically, because of their groundbreaking work, in many ways, things are not perfect, but they've gotten better in schools because all of a sudden there was attention paid to the experiences of LGBTQ youth. This is why I feel like for these kids, it's important to try to understand what kinds of experiences they're having. So I want to open it up a little bit for conversation, and if you like, afterwards we can, I can share some steps to improving school climate, but I think we'll break up my blah, blah, blahing and have this as truly a fireside chat. So Stella.
Good afternoon and good morning. I'm on the West Coast, so I'm really happy to join you all. I'm based in Los Angeles. I'm an alum 2007, and I really appreciate your talk. I remember you and your husband when I was at Hugsy, so thank you, Dr.
Back a million years ago.
Very many years ago. Yes.
You look too young for that.
Oh my goodness, it's the lighting.
Well, it works. It works.
Great. I appreciate this because I've followed your work for these many years, and some of the questions I have having to do around what geographical region. I myself am a first gen student as well, and I've gone through LAUSD, the Los Angeles Unified School District, which has been deemed the second largest and one of the worst in the nation. So I'm happy to be a product, and I want to always do better in our schools to do better. And so I want to ask you, when you looked at the schools, I know there was a lot of bias because of the selection and where you were allowed access, but what geographic regions were you looking? That's one question.
Yeah, I wish I had the chart in front of me and I can look it up, but basically we had, you know, a couple schools in California, a couple schools in Massachusetts, one in Louisiana, with different places in the country, to be
Got
honest.
it. So it was spread
And
across.
most were public, one was private.
Got
Yeah.
Got
And in the first study, we got whoever would come on board, to be honest.
Mhm.
And yet we still had, and the study that I just shared with you is based on that data.
Got it.
And we did establish the first generation was having a different experience. Unfortunately, in ideal sampling, you have even sampling of, equal number of first generations, equal number of second, equal number of third generation. In this sample, we had fewer first generation kids. In the second study that we did, we oversampled schools with lots of first generation kids. And those schools, the ones who participated, were the ones who said, come on down, we're proud of what we're doing.
Mhm.
And that's why we weren't really able to test our model.
Got it. I
So-
think it's interesting because I think the waves of immigration have shifted as well. And so there was like a pause, and then there was like a
Yeah.
uptick. And so I think right now we're experiencing, I don't know, at least for the area that I'm in Los Angeles, we're experiencing an uptick because of the unfortunate
Yep.
situations in the world.
Venezuelans and yep.
Exactly. And so I'm wondering,
Thank
have you thought about looking at like dual immersion programs, or is that like a bias that you introduced that sort of then further complicates your research? Because I think kids, and maybe doing some comparison, some control case comparisons, because I think like dual immersion programs, I'm thinking specifically of the Glendale Unified School District and LAUSD, kids who are first generation are starting to be put in these programs because one, they have, the language proficiency that they're being matched with for the dual immersion. So I just thought it would be an interesting research to do, because I think they're coming as refugee or some status from, some form of trauma they've already experienced, and then coming here to find that belonging, and what is that looking like? I think that's so interesting to me, because that's kind of the experience I came from 30 years ago with, or, went through. And so I'm just curious, again, repeating that 3 decades later with this generation. I'm just curious to see how that's going to play out, and what their experience is like because there wasn't dual immersion when I came.
You ask a great question. And, I happen to be a big believer in, dual immersion, dual language programs. I think that they do a better job. They're not perfect, by the way. I mean, I've noticed that sometimes when, because there's such a push to have, I'm getting lots of hands, so that's great. I'm going to get to you in a minute. What I've noticed is that, sometimes there are privileged kids in those schools, and the privileged kids get more attention sometimes than the non-privileged kids. And so it's complicated as to whether they're perfect, but in general, they tend to do better. The climates are better for these kids in the beginning, at least. And one of the big shocks in our one of the big shocks for the students that we followed in our longitudinal study is that they were first in these protected bilingual spaces, and then they got thrown into the real world, or the kind of the non-bilingual spaces. And there was this momentary drop in performance because they were, they lost that nurturing space. So I hear what you're saying, and I believe in it. Now, let me just go back and say, I'm in the last stages of my work, given that I've been doing it for 3 decades. And my agenda at this moment, and what I'm focusing on, is how do we capture the fact that, or the likelihood that immigrant students are likely to be having different climates in different spaces. Like, how do we even capture whether or not that's happening? And right now our measures don't allow us to do that, because they're not even being counted. And so what I've had to try to do to even try to begin to establish it systematically is to come and say, principal, Gonzalez, Principal Smith, Principal, Vankowski, would you please let us in? And that's not systematic way of doing this. And what I'd like to see happen is to have just a couple of routine questions added demographically to the questions that our school districts are already buying into. Lots of school districts are buying into Panorama, Youth Truth, and a number of other measures. And let's just, so that we know. And then you're absolutely right. Then we do the comparative studies and we look at this and that and what makes for differences. But until we don't know this. It's invisible. And this is my social justice agenda of the moment, which I'm hoping to get as many people to come on down with. So Lucia, I'm sorry, I'm gonna go, Cheryl, I think was, actually, Lisa, can you help me take people in the order they come in, because they don't, I've seen at least 4 hands and I can't.
Yes. Yes. So Cheryl is next.
Okay, great, Cheryl. And then I think it's Cheryl, Lucia, Maria. Okay.
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for this space and all you've shared. I am really interested in learning more about what can be done with immigrant populations. I graduated this year in May, EPA, and I moved to New York, and I am a volunteer for an immigration clinic in Brooklyn.
Mhm.
So what happens is we are in this church with 70 more or less families, and they are receiving legal counsel for their situation. And we have tons of children, maybe over 100, and 3-4 people as staff. And what I am trying to do now is design a manual of contents that could be run by the volunteers for them, working on belonging. But I'm still this is my question. What would your recommendation would be? I know it's a little bit far from what you explained and the core theme, but it's so important right now because these children are living in shelters, so they don't even have a house. And when we give them toys or aircraft that they done with us, they cannot take it home because they will be taken away. So the sense of belonging is very difficult to foster.
I can see that, because belonging to what? Belonging to the
Exactly.
shelter they're in right now, belonging to the new country, belonging to their old country. I mean, belonging is often associated to a space of some kind. And so your challenge is, how are you if belongingness is what you're trying to foster, it's belongingness to what?
What I'm working on right now is a lot of exercises, and the idea I came up with is to belong into a secret code language that only the children who came to be part of our exercises know.
And tell me, I'm interested in why you picked that, and I'm just curious. So it's like their secret, like that we are in this together. This is like a bond.
Right. So what we do is I'm designing many different types of activities. Last time we did like a drawings of what they desire in terms of physical things and also in terms of non-physical things. And at the end we concluded and we said, okay, we're going to give we are assigning this gathering of 5 words. Well, it was a phrase in Spanish because most of the children, everyone speaks Spanish. So they were told that no one else but who shared that experience knows this combination of words. So if in 10
gave them a sense of
years,
okay, we're uniquely congealing around this group.
Yeah, and the idea was that if in 10-20 years they get together or they recognize each other, they would know this code because only they share it.
So Cheryl, I see a lot of other questions, but I might suggest you get in touch with Veronica Boix, Boix, Mansilla, Mansilla at Project Zero. She developed a curriculum for children in shelters, in detention centers, basically, who are on their way, who are, you know, temporarily in those shelters, and they're going to be transferred to schools elsewhere in the country or to new spaces. And she had a very creative curriculum that she came up with. I don't know whether she's willing to share it, but she'd be worth having a conversation with.
Thank you.
You're most welcome. Okay, next question.
There were some folks with hand raised, but I don't see them raised anymore.
Cheryl, I thought Cheryl had her
here,
hand
I'm
up at
here.
some point.
Uh,
Okay, sorry, Lucia.
yeah, can I go ahead?
Oh,
please.
yes.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, and can you see me?
Yes, we can too. You have a beautiful
right.
curtain behind you.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it, and lots of ideas came to mind as I was hearing you speak. I'm joining you from Cyprus. This is
Oh,
an island in the crossroads of 3 continents.
mhm.
So I believe we understand a bit about immigration,
I did you a bit, a lot.
but at the same time, I believe we really do not, and we have lots to learn. I have served as a principal of a school in my neighborhood, where we had lots of students from Syria,
Mm.
mainly. And as I was having all sorts of various resistances from different groups of people, 2 ideas kept coming out. And these ideas were reinforced as I was hearing you speak. And the first one is the issue of defining public school, really, the purposes of it, who is entitled to public schooling, what who is the public schooling to serve in the first place. So if we start a more substantive conversation around the purposes of public schooling and how it is that we run it and we understand it in the first place, this, I believe, may take us a step further towards understanding the experience of immigrant children in schools. That's one dimension I wanted us to think about. The second one is this. I found that oftentimes we look at immigrant children under the charity model.
Under the, I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
The charity model, the charity, as though they are
Charity,
really,
okay, yes.
as though they are really at a disadvantage,
Mm-hmm.
and
A
as
deficit
though,
model. The
right,
deficit model.
the deficit or the charity model,
Mhm.
and we don't realize that we're doing that. So throughout my years in the schools here, I have been trying to sort of shift this model and place the students as in the center of things, as though they are assets, which they are.
Mhm.
So this is my contribution, and again, I thank you very much for your talk.
Lucia, thank you so very much for your comments. I'm 100% aligned with you on both points. I think that these children, yes, they face challenges, usually imposed upon them by the constrictions and restrictions of the ecology around them. And they have extraordinary resiliencies as well, which the more I work with them, the more it's blatantly clear. So 100% agreed with you. And then the who's responsible question, the first question you bring up, I've always taken the position that these are our children. Some of them may return, but many and most will be part of our, they're part of our schools right now, and they are going to be part of our society moving forward. So it behooves us to embrace them and do the best we can to give them the best possible experience. They're our children, so. Yeah, so I 100% agree with you. Unfortunately, not everybody takes that same stance. And there's a lot of them and using that I'm sure you have to deal with on the ground with politicians as well as parents who are, fighting for their own children who they think shouldn't have to share with newcomers.
Thank you.
Maria. Maria is an old student. Not old, but a
Oh,
student from long
Carola,
ago.
I'm starstruck and so happy to see your
Nice to
face.
see you.
And I've known your work for decades now and followed you to NYU. I'm so thrilled to see your name pop up in this email. And
Thank you, Maria. We had the pleasure and the honor of working together at NYU and writing together, and it's great to see you.
great to see you. Thank you for this talk. I misunderstood the initial question to what do you attribute the resistance to including immigrant origin students in climate assessments, but I still think that how I had misunderstood it is something that I'd like to hear your thoughts on, which is difficulties working with immigrant origin families and stakeholders in the school in ideas like this. I actually very recently conducted a school climate survey for a Japanese immersion preschool here in Brooklyn, New York. And we had such a difficult time finding measures that were appropriate that we actually constructed some of our own. But one of the things that we found very difficult, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, are just around the ideas of translation, and not just about words or questions, but these concepts that have been so hard to convey to Japanese population, both the families and the kids, but also the teachers and administrators, because ideas that we wanted to have reflected in our work, like institutional trust or agency, like the ideas that happen to pop up in the established school climate measures, they're not the ways that Japanese people happen to think about their schools, and it just required so much. I wonder how Western the ideas around school climate are to begin with, and then to study people's perceptions and experiences of school climate when they're maybe not accustomed to thinking about things through these lenses in the first place. Do you have that sort of difficulty in your research?
Oh, I think you're bringing up a really important set of questions. So there are different levels of resistance, right? So there's resistance from administrators saying, either we don't think it's that important.
Right.
We already are catching it by asking about race.
Right.
Right? Or, are they in EL programs? So we already know. They're not the same thing. So, but there are administrators who resist it for that reason. There are administrators who resist. So I'm going to get to your answer. I will answer you, I promise you. Then there's resistance around, we don't really want to know because it probably isn't going to look that good. And then there's resistance coming out of a protective place, that immigration and undocumented are correlated in a lot of people's minds, even though they're not the same thing. I mean, there are Venn diagrams, so, but they're not the same thing. And there are ways to ask it, especially in disaggregated data, where, it isn't gonna expose folks. but there is the Department of Ed has said they never ask anything related to any, so some administrators are coming out of a protective space, so that there's administrative resistances to it. Then there are parent resistances to it, and the resistances again can be around the ones who are undocumented are going to be worried. Then there's like, what do you mean school climate? I just want my kid to go to school and do well. And, what are you getting worried about this stuff? But I think what we have to start with qualitative research, like how welcome do you feel, in the, when you come to school? How does your child, does your child ever report feeling bullied or being left aside? So that I think you need to kind of like dig into the subcomponents, which is why I was so obsessed with like, what the hell is school climate anyways? Because people are banding it around all over the place. But like, which dimensions matter for who, for which outcomes? So I think that you have to start with kind of qualitative ways of understanding of what would matter for the parents, and then what would what do they think it's important to ask about, and how would they feel comfortable asking about it?
Yes.
Including their own identities or their children's identities. And then for kids, it's the same thing. Like, do they think school climate is important? What parts of it? How would they? So I actually have thought a lot about this because I wrote a grant to the Spencer Foundation asking to look at resistance from those 3 different points of view, and came up with a product called Spencer. And their wisdom decided that they didn't think it was an important thing to look at. They funded lots of other wonderful things, so I'm not upset with them. But they didn't, they didn't think it was part of their equity lineup of grants. So, but I do think it is important, and we're not going to move this field forward until we understand how to reach how to ask kids in a way that they're going to feel comfortable, because that's who we're asking. How to ask it in a way that the parents won't, when the kids come home and say, today I got asked X, Y, and Z, that the parents are going to go, what? And in a way that the educator, the principals and the administrators are going to say, yeah, this is important, we need to know. And until I've spoken to Panorama and Youth Truth, they won't include this measure until superintendents and principals pressure them into it. Until they say, we think it's important. So that's how we move the needle in the field. Yeah. Hence my giving talks like this, hoping to mobilize a whole group of people who also think it is important.
Yeah.
So yeah, Maria, I'd be happy to share the protocol that I developed for the grant, because it's going to sit there for a minute. So, it's all about mobilizing social justice warriors in this work.
How exciting. Thank you
Great
so
to
much.
see you, Maria.
So-
Donna.
Oh, okay.
Oh, was there somebody first? Sorry.
Yes, Carola. So I want to get to Donna's question, but Quentin did ask a question in the chat a few minutes ago. I want to get to as well.
Okay. Thank
So,
you. Thank you for keeping me honest.
Yeah, no, it's no problem. So Quentin asks, since the schools that let you in were very positive about what they did with immigrant students, did you try to find commonalities across these successful schools to identify what might be effective practices for welcoming immigrant students and fostering their sense of belonging?
Fantastic question. Haven't done that with this data yet, but I've done it in other studies where we looked at trying to identify promising practices for welcoming immigrant students. So I've done it in other studies qualitatively. I'm happy to send Quentin that information if you'd like. But I haven't had a chance to actually unpack the data yet because we just finished collecting it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Donna, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Carola, and everyone. I'm so grateful for this session. And Marie, how wonderful to see you.
Oh, you know each other? Oh,
Of
what a small world.
Yes,
Love
yes,
it.
it's great. It's wonderful. I know from years ago. So I'm wondering, so some of what you're speaking about, Carola, reminds me of the struggle with social and emotional learning in schools and the pushback and the misunderstanding, and it goes in waves, and sometimes it's, accepted and popular and sometimes not. But I'm also thinking about two other things. One is, I'm wondering if you have had different responses from smaller towns in more rural areas. And I'm thinking particularly about places in New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine, which I'm very familiar with, that have high populations of immigrant students, but they're not asked to do research a lot because they're smaller towns in rural areas. And so that's one question, is I'm wondering if you've had any. And 2 years ago, when I tried to get a foot in the door, I was not very successful in the school district, and that was partly because of COVID. And maybe
Yeah,
that's
COVID colored
yeah.
everything. Yeah.
Changed everything. And the
Yeah.
second thought that I have is wondering about working, having allies who are teachers, school counselors, activists who work directly in the school, allies before even like that we're working with, who know what we're trying to do, as advocates for our research in schools. And I'm wondering about that as well. And in other words, before even the administrators aren't just hearing from us, they're also hearing from teachers and counselors and activists. Yeah.
I agree with both ideas. I think that probably smaller districts who are not over research are going to be more likely to be willing to participate. I think that when we were doing the study, which was 2 years ago, the first wave was 2 years ago and the last wave was a year ago. The post-pandemic fatigue didn't make anything easier. So I can't answer that question. I think in principle, or, in theory, I think you're right. In practice, I don't know. Is the general school exhaustion to research, is it going to hang out? Is there going to be a hangover well beyond the pandemic? I don't know. And then, and we did find that teachers would say, oh yeah, I think this is a great idea, but then they have to get the principal to agree to it, and the principal has to sign off on the form because they have to cooperate with with Youth Truth, who has a whole system, and then they have to set aside a whole day to, not a whole day, it's a period. They basically have to set aside one period that the whole school does it, because it doesn't tell us anything if one classroom does it. It's supposed to be school climate. So it really takes a teacher who's got a lot of stick-to-itiveness and persistence and influence with the principal, which is why I'm increasingly going like, what we have to do is get the people who are already doing these measures just to add these 2 questions. It won't help my research, but I don't care anymore about my research. I just want to know, I want us as a society to know, just like what GLSEN identified, LGBTQ youth are having a different experience. And Houston, we have a problem. Schools need to get their act together and start addressing it. That's what I'm hoping for at this point in time. That's my agenda, not, putting forward another research project for Carola Suarez-Orozco or even my colleagues. It's about naming this issue. And until we do it systematically across schools, we won't know. And so that's where I'd like to see the change at this point.
Thank you.
Rather than piece by piece, one little research project after another, which is just chipping away at it. And by the way, I'm going to add one more thing. I know we're coming up on our time, but GLSEN, I talked to Ken, is it Ken Jennings? Who led the GLSEN study. And he said that they didn't actually do the research through schools. Amazingly. They did it through LGBTQ organizations and then asked students to talk about their schools, which is it's not exactly telling us about school climate, is it? I mean, it's telling us about the populations, LGBTQ youth's experience about schools, but it doesn't tell us specifically about a school. answers a slightly different question. Still an important question still, which is LGBTQ youth are telling us they're having less than optimal experiences in schools. But it doesn't identify the Washington school or the Adams school or the whatever school is doing a better job in comparison to the other school, right? Or a worse job. And I think we really should, kind of, as a principal, you'd want to know which students are being marginalized. So that is la lucha that we have in front of us, the struggle, if you will.
Wonderful.
So, and I'm happy to share my slides with everyone, which where I give some suggestions on how to improve school climate, I'll give you the quick suggestions. One is we need to start by assessing school climate. So we learn about school climate and notice who's consistently being left out in social interaction and who may be targeted, and notice which staff members are most trusted by students and learn from that. We need to cultivate strong school relationships. And taking a page from GLSEN, implement advisory groups in higher grades for kids. Establish school norms around intergroup respect and anti-bullying. We should be implementing culturally sustaining educational approaches, recognizing multilingualism as a strength, decorating halls and common spaces. Understanding multilingual education is much more than just celebrating holidays and heroes, and well embedded in curriculum, and thoughtfully selecting lessons and content, and always approaching the work with cultural humility, knowing that we've never learned everything that we need to learn. This is an ongoing, lifelong process. We need to reflect all of our students in curriculum, integrate a global perspective, include projects that allow students to delve in their own histories and languages and cultures, and recognize students' cultural wealth and their funds of knowledge. We need to support family engagement, provide diverse opportunities for families to participate and listen to our families and use their suggestions to inform decisions. And a great place to start is working with community liaisons. Going back to Lucia's point, placing the child at the center, taking a whole child approach. These students are much more than language learners. We need to recognize the stresses of migration prior to migration, during and after the voyage. We need to recognize acculturation, xenophobia, and racism as part of their lives. But they're also, but this is part of a transition. They will get beyond that if we do a good job of supporting them in schools. And then the last big recommendation is that we take an SEL approach and use tiered supports, where we provide universal supports for all kids and then more targeted interventions as needed. So those are my recommendations in a nutshell. So I want to thank everyone for taking the time out of their very busy days and joining us in this conversation. Some old faces, some new faces, and I hope we can continue in conversation and the good work over time.
Thank you so much, Carola. And everyone will receive a follow-up email early next week with these resources, the recording, the slides, and additional information. So thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you. Have a lovely holiday break, everyone.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you.